Hey, it's Andrew here at BTO Range in Conroe, Texas. Back again. This little rifle on the bench today is one that we've actually had a lot of requests for, and we had the opportunity, thanks to one of our viewers and local customers here at the range. He brought it by for a little bit of work and asked that we do a video on it. And so this is a Winchester Model 70. It's a Pre-64 rifle. And this one is chambered for 300 H&H Magnum, 300 H&H, which was one of the original chamberings in this rifle and one of the original 30 caliber Magnums. We'll get to all that in just a second. But the Model 70, there's no way that one video, it would be hours long if we tried to do the entire history of the Model 70 and all the generational changes that have occurred in the Model 70 since it was introduced. So we'll actually end up, like we did with the Remington 700, we'll end up doing a series of videos on this particular rifle, this particular family of rifles, because there were some significant changes in production over the course of, it's still in production today, but in a different, it's a different rifle really than it was before. So this all goes back to World War I. Prior to World War I and even through World War I, bolt guns, bolt action rifles really in the United States really weren't a big, you didn't see them. Lever action rifles ruled the day for the most part. There were bolt action sporting rifles, primarily European guns. They just had not really entered the U.S. market to any great degree or any great acceptance yet. But World War I changed that. Obviously they were using 1903 Springfields. There were plenty of 98 Mausers out there, Mosin against, or various bolt action guns. And the servicemen coming back from the war were familiar with their operation and their potential. So the various manufacturers started looking at making a bolt action sporting rifle to kind of feed that demand. And they'd been making the bolt action guns for the war effort throughout the war. Both Winchester and Remington were and had been making bolt action rifles. So Winchester had been producing the P-17 or the 1917 infield pattern gun for World War I. And in 1919, one of Winchester's designers, a man named Thomas Crossley Johnson, or T.C. Johnson, put together a rifle that was going to be called the Model 51, alternately called the Imperial or the Model E, like an Echo. So the Model 51 Imperial, which was basically a sporterized P-17 type gun. And the higher-ups at Winchester said, no, I mean, we've got a good thing going with our lever guns and our shotguns. We don't need a bolt-action rifle. That ship has sailed when the war ended, but basically it's what the thought process was. And then Savage brought out the Model 1920 High Power, and Remington introduced their Model 30 Express. They introduced that rifle in 1921. And that was basically an adaptation of the infield bolt action rifle. So, and Winchester was now once again behind the 8 ball. So in 1925, they introduced the Winchester Model 54. The Winchester Model 54 is the immediate predecessor of the Model 70. So the 54 was a slimmed down, it was not really a sporterized anything. The action basically is more Springfield 03 than it is Enfield or 98. And so it is more of an 03 Springfield clone than a 98 clone, but still not truly a clone of either one. But the Model 54 Winchester introduced in 1925, and with that rifle, it was introduced. They introduced the 270 Winchester centerfire caliber, 270 WCF, still in production today, obviously known as the 270 Winchester now. So that was a big deal, and it's still one of the most popular calibers in production today, the 270 Winchester. So, but the Model 54 suffered from some of the same problems that the military style rifles did really heavy trigger pull. It had a very long lock time in the bolt, very heavy firing pin fall, that type of thing. So it was a bolt action rifle, and it was a sporter grade bolt action rifle, but it still wasn't, I guess, what it could be. So one of the changes that people wanted was a better trigger. So they redesigned everything during the time of the production in 1929, for example, Great Depression, stock market crash. By 1931, Winchester goes into receivership, and they're bought by the Olin Corporation and became Winchester Western with the Western Cartridge Company. So 1933, they begin to make the design changes to the Model 54 to come up with a more modern bolt-action rifle to better suit consumers. And they did. About 1935, we see the Model 70. So they took the Model 52 rimfire trigger and adapted it for the centerfire rifle, so we had a good, nice, adjustable trigger in the gun. They changed the front action screw placement. In the 54, the front action screw screws into the bottom of the recoil lug. This, on the Model 70, it screws into the receiver behind the recoil lug, making the bedding of the action a little bit more consistent. The bolt handle, the geometry of the bolt handle and of the safety were altered to accommodate a scope. Now the 54 had a scope mount. The front receiver ring was drilled and tapped. The rear receiver ring was not drilled and tapped, but it did have, let's clear this rifle so I can show you what we're talking about here. Let's turn it around just completely. So the Winchester 54 was drilled and tapped here, and then it was drilled and tapped on the side of the receiver for the receiver sight, right? So the Winchester 70 was also initially. So the pre-war, the early pre-war Model 70s utilize the same scope bases as the Model 54, and all of those are out of production. So you have to find either a vintage scope base, like this particular Bausch & Lomb scope base that's on this rifle here, or you have to otherwise make do. You might find an old Redfield JR mount that's still available on eBay, but there are no current mounts for the Model 54 or the pre-war 70. They both use the same mount. So after World War II, the Model 70 went through two more receiver tops. They had a different rounded receiver top instead of the flat receiver top, still undrilled, and then they went to the receiver that they have basically from their Ford that was drilled and tapped. The rear ring and the front ring were drilled and tapped. So, and that's what this is. This is a 1954 gun. So it is drilled and tapped under here, even though this particular mount utilizes the receiver sight holes. So they also changed the stock when they went from the 54 to the 70. They made it a little bit wider, a little bit flatter here on the bottom than was on the 54. Make it a little bit more comfortable in the hand for better shooting. So it became a more shootable rifle, I guess, is where that's going. And gosh, it became one of the best-selling rifles that Winchester ever did. It was and in fact, one of the marketing things was the rifleman's rifle was a slogan for the Winchester 70. And it became synonymous with bolt-action rifles, even until Remington was producing the 720, 721 series. And what eventually happened in 1964 with the Remington 700 in production was less expensive to manufacture, so Winchester had to deal with the manufacturing costs, both labor and materials, and then all the 1964 changes happened. So we'll do a different video on pre-64 versus post-64, the changes that were made in the gun, because it's pretty significant for this model for the Winchester 70. So that's worth a video in and of itself. So there were, like I said, there were 3 receiver types in the Pre-64, the Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 are the pre-war, the transitional, and the post-war receivers. So if you're going to scope a 54 or a pre-war 70, it may be difficult to do. It may be best off not doing it, in fact, and retiring that rifle as a collector's item and purchasing a rifle, a more modern rifle, more suitable for telescope mounting than those guns were. So this particular rifle is 1954, 300 H&H Magnum, not Winchester Magnum, but H&H Magnum. And if you notice this particular scope, this is a Bausch & Lomb Balvar, B-A-L-V-A-R, 4-power scope in Bausch & Lomb mounts. Now this scope does not have internal adjustments. It's a straight crosshair scope on the inside. The adjustments are done on the mount itself. So the thought process behind that is the scope would be sturdier, the scope would be less prone to damage, and you could ostensibly take the scope off and put it back on with a fairly reliable return to 0, or so the thought process went anyway. So, and it's not uncommon to see these older scopes with the mount system on the base. And in fact, the unilateral target scopes, alignment target spot, things of that nature, had mounts like that all the way well into the 70s and 80s. So that's not horribly unusual. So there was a version of the 70, there are a few versions of the 70 Super Grade, which had upgraded wood and better finishes, things of that nature. And then they had the 70 Featherweight. 70 Featherweight, shorter barrel, had aluminum. They did away with this hump here on the barrel for the rear sight. Aluminum bottom metal instead of steel, aluminum butt plate instead of steel, and had 2 7-inch long holes drilled into the stock from the back to try to lighten it up. But still, by today's standard, even a 70 Featherweight's a fairly heavy gun, and a 70 standard weight is definitely a heavy gun compared to some of the composite stock rifles that we have now. But my personal view, for what that's worth, walnut and blued steel will always win the day for me. But I mean, everybody to each their own. They still make walnut and blued steel guns, a few, but to me, that's what the rifle is supposed to look like. But so let's talk real quick about the 300 H&H cartridge. It's not one that you see very much anymore. In fact, this morning I checked a couple of our larger distributors that we use at the range, and I found only 3 300 H&H Magnum loadings available. There were 2 from HSM and 1 from Nosler. And I checked Hornady's website. They don't show 300 H&H anymore. Neither do Remington, Winchester, or Federal. I don't see any 300 H&H loadings from any of the major cartridge manufacturers anymore. And that's a shame. It is an obsolete cartridge, or becoming an obsolete cartridge. It's a long cartridge with a very sloped cartridge body and a long neck. Basically 375 H&H, neck down to 30 caliber. So there are a lot more efficient cartridges on the market. 300 Win Mag was introduced in 1963, and that was pretty much the end of the 300 H&H. It lasted for years after that, but effectively it spelled the beginning of the end for the H&H cartridge. So that said, 300 Win Mag introduced in 1963. So if you find one of these rifles in 300 Win Mag, they were only made for 1 year in that particular caliber in the Pre-64 gun. So that's kind of a holy grail collector gun, one of the rare calibers in the Pre-64 gun. 300 H&H is up there in the rarity mark. I mean, 270, 30-06, 243 are the more common cartridges, but they made it in the Savage cartridges, some metric cartridges. They made really small runs in things like 22 Hornet, 25, 35 Winchester, very small runs in those. So there is a lot of niche collectability and a lot of price variation based on what the original chambering is. So 300 H&H Magnum is a desirable chambering in the Pre-64 Model 70 simply from a production standpoint. So in 1925 is when the 300 H&H cartridge was brought out by Holland & Holland. It was initially called the Holland Super 30 cartridge, and it was developed for double rifles, and it was developed for the bolt guns, Rigby and things of that nature, and Holland. So, and it really became newsworthy, I guess, or it really got on the map about 1935 when it was used to win some high-profile 1,000-yard rifle competitions in 300 H&H. And because it was pushing those heavy 30 caliber bullets faster than anything else, faster than 30-06 could, and there were some 30 Newton. I mean, there were a lot of Wildcat rounds out there, but as far as a factory available cartridge, if you wanted a 300 Magnum in 1930, 1935, it was a Holland Magnum. So Winchester introduced that, or Winchester brought it out as one of the original chamberings in the Model 70, and that really kind of cemented its fame up until relatively recently when, as we just said, there's only 3 loadings from relatively small ammunition manufacturers. HSM and Nosler is all I found. There may be others, but that's all I found at one of the largest distributors in the country. So let's look at this rifle in particular. So 1954 gun. We have a 26-inch barrel, which is standard for this gun in 300 H&H. So we have the hooded front sight, which is original. The reason this gun was checked in is this flip rear sight had lost its detent, so we replaced that sight for the customer. This is the correct rear sight for this particular rifle. So how would we evaluate this Pre-64 Winchester in 300 H&H? We would go back to the same 3 things we always talk about, right? Originality, scarcity, condition. So let's look at originality. The only thing not original on this gun, obviously the scope. It didn't come with the scope, but the scope is period correct. So it's not like the gun has a Vortex crossfire on it or a Picatinny rail with something else on it, which would be out of place on a 1954 hunting rifle. So the scope, to me, although it doesn't bring very much to the table, it does bring a little bit of value added to this rifle because it's period correct, as opposed to an inexpensive modern scope, which we quite literally would have taken off the rifle if we had this gun to sell. So the only thing that's not correct here is this pad. It is a Winchester marked pad, but these guns were not padded from the factory, even in 300 H&H. This would have had a steel butt plate. And it is a Winchester marked rubber pad. It is, I guess, it's an okay job, but it's not really a very seamless job of pad installation on here. The toe angle is correct, but it's just not smooth. So my thought process, it was probably ground on the rifle, and people were just very careful. Whoever did it was very careful to try to not pull it off. So the stock's been cut back. The length of the pad, or just a little bit more, in this pad was added. So the length of pull on this gun's 13.5 inches, so we're a little short of the length of pull that the gun came from the factory at. So the stock modification is going to be a big deal for collectors, probably not so much for shooters. Even though 300 H&H doesn't have the recoil of even 300 Win Mag, it still has more recoil than 30-06. So there is recoil there. So the pad is probably a good addition for a shooter, but for a collector, and this would be an extremely collectible gun, this does deter a bit from the money. So scarcity, as years go by, just from attrition, Pre-64 Model 70s, they're going away. I mean, they're falling out. They're breaking. They're deteriorating. They're just fewer today than there were a few years ago. At least certainly fewer out on the marketplace. So the supply and demand chart is real, and money just keeps going up on Pre-64 M70. So the 300 H&H Magnum is a desirable cartridge in this gun. It's one people look for to fill a hole in their collection. It's relatively easy to find 270, 30-06, 243, things of that nature. But some of the calibers are harder to find. 300 H&H, again, a standard caliber. It's not like 9.3 by 62 or 250 Savage or anything like that, which would be an extremely rare find in the Model 70. But it's still a desirable cartridge, so that helps quite a bit. And then we look at condition. So we have quite a bit of the original rust blue here on the barrels, which is good. The matte finish here is correct. This would actually be hot blued in 1954 from Winchester. So not all the 54s and the pre-war guns were rust blued. So this would be actual nitride or hot oxide bluing from 1954. The stock finish is original. The checkering is a little bit worn, but it's not damaged. It's not chipped outward. The stock's not cracked. So all that's good. This would be a decently graded gun. Definitely a high end on the shooter condition and an okay collector edition gun, especially if somebody is trying to fill that 300 H&H hole in their collection. So just doing some checking around on the interwebs this morning to see what realistically this gun would retail at. I think there are some people asking a significant amount, well over $2,000 for a gun like this. I don't think it'll pull it. I think $1,600 to $2,000 is probably where this gun is going to live at a retail value with the scope. And that's arguable because, as we've said before, gun or anything is worth exactly as much as somebody's willing to pay for it. So, but I firmly believe that if this gun were to go to auction and you hit two people that want the gun at the same time, I think that'd be a safe range to bet that it would pull between $1,600 and $2,000. Again, this pad, it would be comfortably $2,000 plus if that pad wasn't there, if that was the butt plate. So just a real quick how to clear this gun, and we're not going to do a take apart on the gun today. We may pull it out of the stock for a future video. We'll have to see. I don't intend to take this Bausch & Lomb scope off, but to pull this great big long barrel, I've got to make sure I don't hit anything here. So the bolt release is here, and that's the same place it is now on Winchester 70 rifles. So just holding that bolt down, we can pull that, or the bolt release down, we can pull the bolt out. And we have the long extractor. We have a true control round feed action. You see there's no, the bolt, there's no rim here. So the bolt slides up from the magazine, the cartridge head comes up under the extractor and it feeds into the chamber. So this is a true control round feed, which with all the Pre-64s are. They went to a push feed in 1964 and they're back to a control round feed now. This has the later style safety on it. The earlier guns had a different profile on this safety lever that could interfere with the ocular bevel of the scope, so that's one of the changes they made during the transition from the 54 to the 70, and the earlier pre-war 70 still had the large domed safety on it as well. So we have this flattened bolt here. Again, this was one of the changes when they went to the Model 70 to accommodate the ocular bevel of a scope. So with the bolt out, you can now obviously clean the rifle from the muzzle, or from the chamber end instead of the muzzle, which is definitely what you want to do on this gun. So that really, we'll do another video on pulling this out and taking a look at the trigger. The current Model 70s, by the way, Winchester doesn't make anything in the United States anymore. The Winchester Model 70 today is made in Browning's factory in Viana, Portugal, and imported by Browning Arms Company. Browning owns the Winchester trademark. So anything Winchester is either made in Japan or Portugal or Turkey. It just is what it is. And the current Model 70s, we have Model 70 featherweights at the store. They're nice rifles. They're all CNC machined. From a pure machining standpoint, they're probably superior to the older guns, but they don't have the fitting. They don't have the smoothness. And to me, they just don't have the class of the old Pre-64 guns. And a lot of people feel that way. But if I were going to pick a shooting rifle in the Winchester 70s, I wouldn't feel bad at all about using one of the newer production Model 70 guns. So anyway, Winchester Model 70, this is a Pre-64 gun, 1954. 300 H&H Magnum with a Balvar 4-power scope from Bausch & Lomb and Bausch & Lomb mount. So it doesn't get more classic than that. If you like what we're doing, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. We try to put stuff out a couple of times a week, either historical videos like this one or take apart videos or something along those lines. Check out our sister channel, bigtexordnance.com. They do a lot of high-speed, low-drag stuff. They have a podcast about training and things of that nature. So we appreciate you watching and have a good day.